Good afternoon, teachers, and welcome to Lesson 5 of AP Macro Unit 2. Today we're going to be talking relatively briefly about the unemployment rate. So we're going to organize this around a couple of big questions. So the first big question I like to introduce the kids is kind of the obvious one. What is the unemployment rate? So understanding the basic components of who is and isn't considered unemployed is actually pretty important for the purposes of this unit because it's going to help us to understand how the unemployment rate actually undercounts the true amount of unemployment in the economy towards the end. And in addition to that, it's also going to help us to understand how jobs can be created, but the unemployment rate either remains steady or the unemployment rate goes up. So let's go over the basics of who is and isn't considered unemployed. These numbers are going to be gathered by the U.S. government's Bureau of Labor Statistics, or the BLS. So in order to be considered unemployed in the United States, you basically have to meet three criteria. You have to be eligible to work in the first place. You have to be actively seeking work. That one's going to be really important later on. And you can't actually find a job. So if you can work, want to work, are actively seeking employment, and you can't find a job, those are the requirements for the U.S. government to consider you as unemployed. This is important for a couple of reasons. Most notably, there's large swaths of the population that don't have jobs but also aren't going to be considered unemployed for the purposes of our calculation here, including but not limited to people who are too young to work, people who are retired, stay-at-home parents, most importantly for us, discouraged workers. So these are workers who had been looking for a job at one point, but gave up and stopped seeking work because they didn't think they could find it. The moment those workers stop seeking additional jobs, they fall off of our unemployment statistics. That'll become important. In addition, we also don't include people who are disabled or people who are institutionalized, be it people who are in prison or full-time students or those types either. So once we understand who the basic people within the unemployment rate are, we can then go about actually calculating the rate. Before you can calculate the unemployment rate, the first step in this process is you need to solve for the number of people in your country's labor force. So the labor force is total population minus all of the people that are legally ineligible to work. So for the purposes of the United States, this might be total population minus everybody under the age of 16. If your country has different rules and regulations for who is and isn't allowed to work, those would come into play here when you calculate the labor force. Once you found the number of people in the labor force, finding the unemployment rate is relatively simple. All we're going to do is we're going to take the number of people that we've counted as unemployed, divide it by the number of people that we counted in the labor force, and multiply that number by 100 so that we can get a percentage rate. So real quick, today we're running through unemployment rate. We know who's unemployed. The unemployment rate equal to number of people unemployed divided by labor force times 100. Now that we understand the basics of the unemployment rate, we need to move into a couple of more specifics because oddly enough, for the purposes of AP Macro, it actually matters the reason why you're unemployed. And so there's different types of unemployment that actually have different effects on the economy. And this is something that the kids consider to be a little bit weird, but it's something that's worth looking into. So big question number 2 is, why are people unemployed? And I like to frame this around the old movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, because there's essentially 3 different types of unemployment, and I think just labeling it the good, the bad, and the ugly helps the kids to kind of wrap their brain around the 3 primary reasons why people might find themselves unemployed. So the first level of unemployment, what we consider to be quote-unquote good unemployment, is what's called frictional unemployment. Frictionally unemployed workers are workers who are in the process of voluntarily changing jobs. So if I quit my job because I think I can get better benefits or better pay or a better working environment elsewhere, and I'm confident that I can get that better job, I might be temporarily frictionally unemployed. We generally consider frictional unemployment to be a good sign within the economy because if workers are willing to leave a sure thing job that they already have in order to chase a better one that they don't have their hands on just yet, that shows that workers have a relatively high level of confidence in the labor market, and that probably means the consumer confidence index is high and the economy is doing relatively well. You don't see a lot of frictionally unemployed people in the middle of recessions because if I don't think that I can get another job, I don't want to give up the job that I currently have. So frictional unemployment, it may not be good in and of itself, but it's usually a sign of something good happening in the economy. Lots of confidence in the labor force and their ability to get better pay and better wages. So we're going to label frictional unemployment to be the good. Your second type of unemployment, which is called cyclical unemployment, we're going to label the bad. Cyclically unemployed people are people who've lost their jobs due to a downturn in the economy. So when the economy goes into a recession, a lot of times suppliers will scale back production because consumers have stopped buying. And when they scale back production of their goods and services, they're going to have to lay off some percentage of their workforce, especially as the recession drags on. They'll lay off higher and higher percentages of their workforce. So these people are considered to be cyclically unemployed because they are unemployed due to the business cycle, which is where that word cyclical is coming from. We consider cyclical unemployment to be really, really bad because cyclical unemployment, unlike the other two types, has a big impact on GDP through a formula that we're going to talk about a little bit later called Okun's Law. So the level of cyclical unemployment actually has an inverse relationship with GDP. We'll get to that in just a couple of minutes, but that's why this is the bad, because of the three, this is the one that actively damages the economy most. Last but not least, we have structural unemployment, which I'm going to call the ugly. Structurally unemployed people fall into a couple of different categories. The primary category of those who find themselves structurally unemployed are people who did a job that pretty much no longer exists. Normally, this is due to technological advancement. But in addition to people who did jobs that don't exist anymore, jobs may also not exist either in their location, so the jobs might have moved overseas through globalization, or they may no longer exist at the wage that these people were initially demanding. So these jobs may have gone down substantially and essentially left these people out of the workforce. We consider structural unemployment to be ugly because of the three, this is by far the hardest one to deal with. We'll consider these people structurally unemployed because they lack the skills to do additional jobs. So they did a job for a long time, they were good at it, the job ceased to exist for one reason or another, probably technological advancement, and because that job is what they were good at, they don't have the skills to get alternate employment in the economy. And so these people are more or less permanently unemployed unless we can get them some kind of jobs training or we can get them back to school to retrain their skills. So this is the ugly side of unemployment. I usually use the city of Detroit as kind of my go-to example for describing structural unemployment. The city of Detroit's economy, used to be really, really good. It's based around the auto industry. When auto production moved to the southern United States and some of it moved overseas, a lot of people who'd spent 20 years in a Ford factory, screwing in bolts onto a Ford Taurus, lost their jobs. And because that reliability of those jobs had been really high for a long time, they didn't necessarily have college degrees or the ability to do anything else. So if all you know how to do is build cars and they don't build cars in your city anymore, you're going to have a real hard time finding an alternative unemployment. So this is why I like to tell the kids that you need to make sure that you keep your skills up and make sure that your job skills are constantly honed, because technology and technological advancement changes jobs over time. If your kids don't really understand Detroit, which mine were like, what, Detroit? A couple of other examples, probably the one they're most familiar with would be the example of some of the changes that McDonald's is making. So McDonald's is slowly but surely phasing out their cashiers and the people who take their orders in lieu of a giant touchscreen. So you can go into some McDonald's, you type in your own order, you swipe the card and pay, and somebody brings out your food. They've completely eliminated one entire class of employee and replaced them with technology, in this case, the cashier. Now, structural unemployment has a couple of major things within the economy that actually affect the overall rate of structural unemployment. So if structural unemployment is something that we're worried about, there are certain policies that make this worse and certain policies that make this better. Let's make a list of the policies that tend to increase the economy's overall rate of structural unemployment. The first of which, and probably the most significant of which, is the implementation of the minimum wage. So when you set a minimum wage for a particular job, you'll essentially create structural unemployment for every job below that wage that's just not worth raising the wages on. So for example, in the United States, if you have to pay, people who pick blueberries, if you have to pay them $7.25 an hour plus benefits, farmers wouldn't actually turn a profit. And so we see those jobs, one of two things happens when you raise minimum wages. Either some of those manual labor jobs get turned over to machinery, or some of those jobs get turned over essentially to the black market, which is what we see with farm labor. It's primarily done by black market transaction, foreign workers who are willing to work for below the legal minimum wage, because at the minimum wage, those jobs more or less don't exist. Other things that will raise the level of structural unemployment in your economy would be strong labor unions for very much the same way or same reason as minimum wages. So labor unions generally make production more expensive by demanding reasonable hours and higher wages and better benefits. All of those things are just effectively an increase in overall wages, which will push some percentage of the workforce out of eligibility for getting jobs. Last but not least, another thing that sometimes comes up that will create structural unemployment is when employers opt to pay what we call efficiency wages, or we sometimes call this incentive pay. So if you've got a job that's offering to pay people higher, the more they work or the harder they work or the better they are, things like a job based on commission, you'll actually see, if this becomes widespread enough, an increase in overall structural unemployment in the economy, as since you're squeezing additional productivity out of each worker as they work harder and harder to get those efficiency wages, you'll end up seeing that you have 2 workers essentially doing the job that was once done by 3, and that third worker will end up unemployed. So incentive pay or efficiency wages, when adopted on a large scale, can also have an impact of increasing the overall level of structural unemployment in the economy. So now that we've gone through the good, the bad, and the ugly of the unemployment rate, I want to make sure that we can kind of put that information together to get an alternative formula for calculating the unemployment rate. So numerically, the unemployment rate is also equal to the percentage of cyclical unemployment in your economy plus the percentage of structural unemployment in your economy, plus the percentage of frictional. So if you're not given the number of unemployed or you're not given the figures for the labor force, you can also get the unemployment rate by essentially smushing together the 3 different types of unemployment. You'll get the same rate that way as well. Moving on to big question number 3. Big question number 3 is basically, why do we care about the unemployment rate? So why is this, as one of the big 3 indicators, relevant to this unit and relevant to GDP, which was the indicator we spent about half of this unit's overall runtime on? So the short answer is because unemployment and GDP essentially have an inverse relationship. So we care about the unemployment rate because the higher the overall unemployment rate is, the lower the level of productivity our economy is going to be. But something the kids need to know for the AP exam is they need to know a slightly expanded version of that. So that's the general gist. But they also need to know that the primary reason we care about calculation of the unemployment rate has to do with this formula that we call Okun's Law. What Okun's Law tells us is that for every 1% of additional cyclical unemployment in your economy, you'll see a shrinking of GDP of 2%. So you basically get a 2-for-1 trade-off, GDP to unemployment. And this is only true for cyclical unemployment, and that's why we call cyclical unemployment the bad, because this is the one that actually creates GDP shortfalls. So the higher your level of cyclical unemployment, the bigger the gap is between what your economy could be producing, which is going to be your potential GDP, and what your economy is actually producing, which is actual GDP. And when we're talking about an economy the size of the United States, we produce $18 trillion a year in GDP. Even a 2 or 3% decline in overall GDP due to cyclical unemployment, we're talking about tens of billions of dollars of lost productivity. So Okun's Law basically kind of quantifies that inverse relationship between unemployment rates and GDP, gives us a little bit better understanding of why it is we kind of stress out when the unemployment rate gets really high. It costs us an awful lot of money to have unused productive resources, be those unused productive resources factories, or in the case of what we're talking about right now, workers sitting at home eating Cheetos when they could be producing. The last thing I want to hit on in this video is I want to talk a little bit about this thing called the natural rate of unemployment. This is going to become very important later on when we get to the Phillips curve in the next unit. So the natural rate of unemployment is abbreviated NAIRU, N-A-I-R-U, and that stands for the non-accelerating inflationary rate of unemployment, which basically is the rate of unemployment below which you'll see inflationary pressure happen. So if the unemployment rate gets too low, there's a lot of competition for jobs, and you'll see wages start to rise as a result of basically producers competing for the same pool of workers, and that creates, or at least can create, high levels of inflation in the economy. So the natural rate of unemployment is A, the rate of unemployment below which you start to see inflationary pressure, and B, it's what we call the full employment rate of unemployment, which I'll tell that to the kids, and they're like, what the heck does that even mean? Essentially, what that definition tells us is that when the economy is operating at full employment, when we are utilizing our productive resources to their maximum, that there's still going to be some percentage of workers without jobs, even when the economy is firing on all cylinders and we're producing as much as we can reasonably be expected to produce. And those workers that are still unemployed are going to be your frictional and your structurally unemployed workers. So I like to draw some of the graphs on the board for the kids to help them kind of visualize what full employment looks like. The one they're going to be most familiar with at this point in the course is the production possibilities curve. So if your economy is currently producing anywhere along the production possibilities curve, you've achieved productive efficiency, which in the macro part of this course we're going to call full employment. Full employment is essentially a productive efficiency on the PPC. Even though they don't know these other two graphs yet, I might go ahead and just show it to them so that it makes sense when they go back. I'll also draw the aggregates by aggregate demand model and show them that essentially the level of productivity shown by the long run aggregate supply curve will also tell you that we're at full employment. So if I'm producing at potential productivity, or YP, that's full employment. And in addition to that, I'll draw the long-run Phillips curve on there. Now, the long-run Phillips curve is sometimes shown as NAIRU, like they'll just label it NAIRU, which is totally acceptable. And what the long-run Phillips curve shows us is what the level of unemployment is going to be, once again, at full employment. So I've labeled them here with A. All of those things labeled A are all examples of what the economy looks like at full employment. And the rate of unemployment at full employment is called the natural rate of unemployment, or NAIRU. We're going to go over in the next unit, we talk about the Phillips curve, a host of things that will cause the natural rate of unemployment to change. But for right now, they just need to kind of be able to identify that. Last but not least, just in case the kids aren't good with algebra, I like to bring up another one. So if we know that the unemployment rate is equal to frictional plus structural plus cyclical, I like to point out that if you have the unemployment rate and you have cyclical unemployment, then the unemployment rate minus cyclical unemployment is the natural rate of unemployment, because the natural rate of unemployment is frictional plus structural unemployment. So if they want to reorganize some of those formulas a little bit, we can get different information out of them. Anyway, that's basically a run through of what the kids need to know about the unemployment rate. I usually spend about a day and a half, so maybe 60 minutes or 75 minutes of class in total running through this. I generally don't have anywhere near the level of difficulty getting the kids to understand unemployment as we do with our GDP. There's just not as much math involved in it. So good luck, and if you need any assistance or any additional guidance, you know where to find me. Thank you.